I was browsing Reddit this afternoon and came across this subreddit for the first time. Even though I'm a big coward when it comes to anything scary, this has to be the perfect place to share a terrifying incident that involved my cousins and myself about 15 years ago. At the time this happened, I was approaching my 16th birthday. My family had a big reunion every year in Southern California. Since I hadn't attended since I was little, my parents thought it would be a fun way to spend my summer break. It would also be a great opportunity to get to know my cousins. There was 3 of them, and they were all girls around my age. After I thought about it, it sounded fun, so I agreed and flew out the next month to Los Angeles. The reunion was held at the same hotel we were all staying in. When I arrived there, I was met by my cousins, Jennifer, Belinda, and Stormy. It was amazing how much alike we all looked. We all had long blonde hair and blue eyes, not to mention our facial similarities, but it made sense since our dads were brothers. The biggest difference was how tan they were. Since I had been inside all winter in Minnesota, they were much darker than me. My uncle and dad decided to let us stay in one room together. It was a big fancy bridal suite. When we saw the room, we came up with this joke that we were sisters and we were staying in the hotel together for my bachelorette party. I was chosen as the bachelorette because I was the oldest and looked a little different, like an older sister often does. We spent the rest of the day at the pool and talking to guys. Stormy, who was only 14, managed to trick a 25-year-old guy into thinking she was 19 and gave her his number. We were having so much fun, we stayed up until about 4 talking and laughing. In the morning, which was about noon for most of us, we ordered breakfast and then headed for the pool again. Our day turned out to be even more fun than the one before it. This time, Stormy got a pair of twins to buy her lunch. That girl was on fire that week. Later that evening, we all got dolled up and had dinner at the hotel's restaurant. But this time, the story we'd created had taken on a life of its own. My cousins had been telling guys all day that we were there to party and asking them to buy them drinks. But most of the men were wise enough to know that they were lying. After dinner, we joined this cute pair of older guys that were sitting in the lobby. When they noticed us leaving the restaurant, they had asked us to sit with them, and since we had nothing else to do, we did. Once we had sat down, they began asking us our ages and names. Of course, we lied and said we were in our early 20s, and they actually believed us. I couldn't help but giggle a bit. This was the most fun I'd had in years. Jennifer and I didn't say much. We left that to Belinda and Stormy. At one point, Stormy invited them up to our room, but I had to take her aside and remind her that her dad was staying in the room next to ours and would surely not like it. I didn't want to be a stick in the mud, but I wasn't comfortable with having 2 strange men who looked to be like 30 or something in our room. At the point it was approaching midnight, I told the 2 younger girls it was time to go back to our room, and they argued at first. But once Jennifer backed me up, they gave in. We told the guys to meet us at the pool around 11 a.m. and we get lunch together. Then we went back upstairs to our room. We stayed up talking about the 2 men and what we were planning on doing when we saw them. That lasted until about 2 a.m. when we decided to go to bed. The lights had just been turned off in the room when we all heard the doorknob start jiggling very fast, like somebody was trying to get in. At first, I thought it was my mind tricking me, but once it started again, I got scared. I asked the other girls if they were also hearing it, and they said yes. Without thinking, Belinda jumped up from her bed and said she would see who it was. I yelled out to her to stop her from opening the door, but it was too late. Jennifer got up and turned on the lights, and I joined her at the end of the hall. When Belinda opened the door, she turned to us and said no one was there, then turned back to the door and stepped out into the hall. That was when we saw a person in a black mask jump out and grab her. As soon as they grabbed her, she began screaming and fighting to get away. By this time, Stormy had joined Jennifer and I. All 3 of us were also screaming and running for the door to help Belinda. When we made it out into the hall, we saw that the person was attempting to drag her to the elevator. Even though she was fighting as hard as she could, she was losing and getting closer to the elevator. Thankfully, my uncle came out of his room to see what was going on and saw Belinda being dragged away. He didn't hesitate to attack the person in the mask. Once he hit them a few times across the head, they dropped her and ran off down the hall. They made it to the stairwell and disappeared. We all ran to her to see if she was okay. She was obviously scared and upset, but thankfully didn't look to be hurt. Once he was sure she was all right, my uncle called hotel security and told them what had just happened, and they called the police. The four of us girls just sat there and held each other and cried. We were all so happy that Belinda was safe. Despite the hotel's attempt at catching the person by locking all the doors, the attacker still managed to get away. When the police arrived, we tried our best to describe the attacker, but since they were wearing all black and a mask, we didn't have much to go on. Belinda was pretty sure it was a man, but that was it. Over the rest of the week, we all spoke to the police several times and repeated what we had been doing the past couple of days. When my uncle heard about our little inside joke about being in town for a bachelor party and how we had been lying to the boys about our ages, he was mad, to say the least. The police told him that one of those boys was most likely the one that had grabbed Belinda. His theory was that they were trying to kidnap one of us to potentially sell us to a trafficker. Since we looked so much alike, it didn't matter which one of us opened the door. He said girls that looked like us were super popular in the rest of the world and that traffickers would pay top dollar for one of us. We were all so scared we spent the rest of the week in our room and refused to answer the door for anyone without a key. As soon as the police said it was okay for me to go home, I took the first flight back to Minnesota. I was still scared of strangers for a long time and had to go to counseling to get over the worst of it. From what my cousins told me later, they did also and found it hard to trust boys that they had just met. Unfortunately, the police were never able to find Belinda's attacker and punish him for what he had done. It had been a long time since this happened, and when we have taken family trips to Disneyland, I've caught myself wondering if one of the men walking around could be the one that tried to kidnap Belinda that night. Then I'd get a shiver down my spine and remember, it could have just as easily been me. I'm employed at a Los Angeles area hotel that was recently the scene of one of the strangest freak accidents I've ever heard of. When I say recently, I may mean as soon as yesterday, or as long as 5 years ago. I'm purposely being vague in order to protect my job and my employer's identity. Don't bother to try to find the place in which this occurred. The few accounts of the incident were reported in a way completely different from the way it happened. I'm just telling the story to make it clear to all of those reading it that life can be snuffed out like a candle, instantly and without warning. With all that out of the way, let's get to the story. When the story took place, I was 27 and had been with the hotel for around 3 years. I'd started as your run-of-the-mill bellboy, but when the opportunity to fill in at the desk came up, I took it. Then a few weeks later, when a permanent job at the desk became available, the managers gave it to me. My managers and myself could tell right off that I was much more suited to desk work. While I had always done my job to the best of my ability, I enjoyed helping people and solving their problems, far more than humping their baggage up and down stairs. Pardon me for tooting my own horn. My only aim is to lay down a small amount of background before I dive headfirst into this crazy tale. My career specifics aside, the hotel itself was always a peaceful and fair working environment. Everyone working there did their level best and on a daily basis to ensure the residents' privacy and safety. Unfortunately, on the day this happened, our usual stellar level of service was found lacking, although through no fault of our own. I guess I've led you on long enough. Let's get to the heart of the matter, shall we? My assistant and I had only just checked in one of the participants an hour earlier. The other gentleman had been in his room since the night before, apparently getting very drunk. The guest next door to him reported later hearing glass breaking at around 5 a.m. When I first heard it, I was at the desk completing the morning regular paperwork. The report of the shot made me jump from my chair. I instantly ran out into the lobby asking every employee I saw if they knew where it came from, but no one was sure. Luckily, the lobby was empty of guests since it was still early. Within a few minutes, a call from one of the members of the cleaning staff came through the desk, and I was called back to take it. She had been working in one of the 5th floor linen closets and had heard what sounded like a gunshot coming from the room across the hall from her. My assistant and I ran up to the 5th floor and knocked on the door of the room we suspected of being the source of the shot, but received no answer. I used the door key to enter, still quietly announcing our entrance just in case we were wrong, but sadly, we were not. Even though I knew a gun was involved, I was still unprepared for what I saw. Upon turning the corner of the room, I saw his body. The gentleman had apparently put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. He was obviously long gone, so I instructed my assistant to call 911 and request they enter through the service entrance in order to not draw attention. You may see this as a crude act, but my job was to think about the hotel's reputation, regardless of my personal feelings. I'm sure the man didn't care. He ended himself in a public place. He had to have known some poor employee would find him. He obviously had no regard for anyone else. Whether you know it or not, people die in hotels on a regular basis, so the police and paramedics were familiar with our practices. When they arrived at the room, they did their job and soon allowed the paramedics to take him away. They gave us the okay to clean the room, and within an hour, it looked just as it had before. Like I said, we were very well versed in cleaning up after the deceased, no matter the way in which they pass. I was a little shaken up, but I did my best to stay composed. I was in a position of leadership, and I didn't want to let the situation get out of hand. Anyone who felt unable to continue work was allowed to go home, and the rest of us had a short meeting in the office so we could air out our concerns. That lasted about an hour, and then we all returned to our work. We tried to return to our normal day's routine, and until around 11 a.m. that morning we had. However, some short time after then, I received a call from another girl in housekeeping. She was obviously upset. Through her tearful words, she told me that when she entered a room to clean it on the 6th floor, she found a man that appeared to be dead on the floor. I'm sure you are thinking the same thing. No way. You gotta be kidding me. I could tell she wasn't, so this time I called the cops myself. They didn't have to be asked this time. They entered through the service entrance once again and met me in the room. I guess they were a bit suspicious about the circumstances because the same detectives arrived to investigate the scene. I left them alone to do their jobs once again and went back to work. Now I was starting to be confused rather than shaken up. Not even hotels have 2 unrelated deaths in the same day. The chances were astronomical that they weren't. All I could do was wait for the detectives to contact me and let me know what was up. An hour or so later, a knock came at my office door. It was one of the detectives. What he told me next is still the craziest story I've ever heard to this day. From what we could tell, the bullet from what occurred this morning on the 5th floor went through the guy's head, through the wall, and diagonally up the floor of this guy's room and hit him in the heart. We were unable to find it this morning, figured it was just stuck in the floor somewhere. He was dead in under a minute. Poor guy never saw it coming. That's probably why he had such a surprised look on his face. Believe it or not, this isn't the first case I've had like this. Sad thing, but it just serves to remind us that life is a precious thing and can be ended in a flash. I'm always sure to tell my wife I love her every day I leave for work, even if we just had a fight. That was it. He said bye and went back to work. My mouth was stuck open. I really thought I'd heard it all growing up in LA, but I've been proven wrong. I felt sorry for both of the poor dudes, but the second guy was just minding his own business, not hurting anyone. It turned out that he was in town to attend his mother's funeral. Now his family would have 2 funerals to attend. The guy who ended up being the cause of this mess was found a week later, to be a local guy that had just lost all of his savings he had invested in some scheme. The note that the officers found in his body stated that he had done this in the hotel so his children wouldn't possibly find him. I can respect him for that, but he didn't bother to think about us, the lowly hotel staff that would have to see his brains sprayed all over the wall. I realized I sound mean, but I still see that guy all the time in my dreams, and it's not cool, believe me. Like I said at the beginning, I posted this story to remind the readers of this sub that we could die at any time, at 6 or 60, from flu or stray bullet. Life has no guarantees or promises. Please remember this. I was recently reminded of something the detective told me. I'm always sure to tell my wife I love her every time I leave for work, even if we just had a fight. Since I first remembered that sentiment, I made sure to do the same with my wife. If there is someone special in your life, perhaps you may want to try it. It truly can't hurt. Expressing your love never can. My friend and I are having a contest to see who had the scariest episode in our lives, and I'm positive that once you see this one, you'll vote me as the winner. You may have already read the story about the broken window and the guy in the woods, but I assure you, mine will be much scarier. This took place when I was 15 years old, and although I'm 25 now, I'm still not sure of what to think of it. At that time, I was enjoying my life, and it seemed to show in my dreams. Almost every one had a positive theme, at least the ones I remembered. Yes, like any normal person, I had nightmares and still do, but they were either not that bad or I forgot them right away. That was unfortunately about to change, and on a family vacation to the hillbilly heaven of Branson, Missouri. Each year, my family tried to pick a new location to vacation in, and this year was Branson. We had been there once, when I was around 10 or 11, but since then, it had opened up a lot more attractions, especially musical theaters. We had just driven in from Oklahoma City, so everyone in the car was tired. Thankfully, my parents were meticulous planners, so our hotel rooms were ready for us when we arrived. I guess since my brother and I were approaching the age where we could be trusted, we were given our own room. Then again, maybe they wanted to get busy in peace. It didn't matter to us either way. The room was really nice. It even had its own little living area with a TV, and we managed to play Call of Duty for around an hour before we decided we should crash. Just like I figured, our folks had us up at the crack of dawn. It never made sense to me why they would do this. I thought the whole point of vacation was to get some rest and relaxation. Instead, they have us up at 8 a.m. and we'd have to sit around for another 2 hours waiting for them. Once they were finally ready to go, my dad would drive us from place to place like his butt was on fire while yelling at Jeff and I the whole time. We couldn't understand why he was so angry and stressed out. That's probably why I don't go anywhere on my holidays off. It always seemed more relaxing just to sit and chill at home. Anyway, we did the usual touristy things that people do in Branson, riding the ducks and stuff like that. We made it back to our hotel room at about 5 to clean up and go out to dinner. I think my dad had some plan for us to go see the Presleys or some hillbilly crap, but we were saved when my brother got sick during dinner, so the remainder of the evening was spent in our room playing the Wii. Jeff started feeling a bit better by bedtime, so we decided to stay up a little longer playing games. I called it about midnight, and it wasn't long before I was asleep. She came at some point, I'm not sure when. I could tell that I'd been asleep for quite some time because it was so hard to move. Then again, that could have been part of her power. Not until later did I see the clock, but that would only tell me the time then and not when she made her entrance. I wasn't aware of her presence at first, but I was already able to see most of the room. My brother was sprawled out in his bed with the covers half off of him, basically the way he'd always slept. The air conditioner's low roar was there hanging in the room, but much quieter than I'd remembered. I just laid there for a moment, taking in the peacefulness of the overall environment, until I noticed a figure just on the edge of my vision. I tried to turn my head sideways to get a better look, but it wouldn't move. This made me a little concerned, and I still had no reason to get upset. Most of the room was still within my sight. When I switched my eyes to the foot of the bed, hers locked with mine. At first, all I saw was her eyes, but her head seemed to grow larger and out of the darkness until it was nearly all I could see. I could feel the rest of her, climbing slowly in occasional bursts up my bed. This was when I truly began to panic. The battle to move anything was a loss. It was like I had been frozen in a block of ice, but without the cold. Even when I felt her hands touch me, I was unable to shrink away. I so badly wanted to scream, just get one short sound out. The tears ran down my temples. I was sure I was going to die. She continued to crawl up the bed until her face sat a mere few inches from mine. This was the first time I could clearly see how horrible her face was. She resembled your stereotypical old witch with hairy moles on her chin and black crooked teeth. Her breath was the worst mix of rotting flesh and musty air. When she first saw my tears, they seemed to excite her. She began shrieking and laughing, running her filthy claw-like fingers in small circles on my bare chest. My fight to break free from her continued, but it gained me nothing. Her weight on my body was starting to be too much, and I began fighting for air. It became obvious to me that her goal was to suffocate me. I knew I couldn't last long without oxygen, and I would be dead in a matter of seconds. Just as I took in my last breath, I woke up. My body took over from there, grasping at any air it could get. Basically, I was hyperventilating. Within a minute or so, I was finally getting control of my breathing and was able to realize what was going on. I stayed laying there on my back for a minute, maybe to reassure myself I was still alive, and very happy to be so. Slowly sitting up, I looked at my body for any scratches or marks, but none were there. I also looked around the room for any sign of the witch, but the only other person in the room was Jeff, still sprawled out in the same position. That was the first time I began analyzing the whole occurrence. Had I really been asleep, having a bad dream, or was it real and what I saw actually happened? Jeff was in the same sleeping position as in my dream, and I'd been able to see everything in the room while being asleep. If I had, that would make that horrid woman real. There was no way I was going to be able to figure it out that night, if ever. I did know I was way too scared to go back to sleep. The alarm clock on the side table said it was 4:35 a.m. Although I was still very tired, I was too afraid to fall asleep, so I went back to the TV and fired up the video. I guess I did nod off again at one point because my mom's banging on the door woke me up at 7:45. After 3+ hours of waiting, I was happy to be back on the road for home. Despite our vacation only lasting the weekend, I got the impression that everyone was happy for it to be over. I know I was, and not just because of the nightmare. Speaking of the nightmare, I found myself scared to go to sleep for at least a week, but once it looked as if though she wasn't coming back, my life went back to normal. Because of my age, I got to avoid family vacations for the rest of my time at home. I made sure to schedule work especially heavy that time of year in order to avoid them. Although I say life soon went back to normal, my fear that she could return still haunts the back of my mind. At least once a week I find myself trying to decide if that was truly a nightmare or if that thing was actually in that hotel room with my brother and I. I've done a small bit of research surrounding sleep paralysis and the like, and I know the hag, as many call her, is a common part of this problem. If the horror that I went through that night was just a scary dream, I hope I have outgrown the condition. But if that woman and her group of monsters are truly real, I can only pray they got their required dose of fear that night, and that they never return to reap another from my newborn son. Here's a story of a scary incident that took place in the early 90s. At that time, I was just out of high school and working my first full-time job. I had no interest in going to college then, so my only option was joining the workforce and becoming an actual adult. My job was a night auditor. If you're not aware what a night auditor does, the job basically requires you to do everything from check-in guests all the way to setting up wake-up calls and balancing accounts for the night. Despite only being 19 and at the usual level of lazy for a kid my age, I loved my job. Well, I loved it most of the time, but when crazy things happen, like what I'm about to tell you, it was probably the worst job in the world. Possibly the scariest thing I have ever experienced occurred on a quiet Monday night. Now, before you hear the story, I should tell you more about the hotel I worked in. It will help in the telling of the story later on, so don't worry. The place was set up in a similar way to those run-down hotels you see in movies. You had your usual covered drive-in at the check-in desk that led into a big parking lot with spaces in front of the rooms. Despite the fact that there were 3 stories, I was told never to check anyone into any of the 3rd-story rooms because of strange occurrences in the past, but that's a tale for another time. Although I may make the place sound massive, in truth I could see every room from the desk. My only blind spots sat just around from the windows, and I could check those on my walkthroughs. Since I'm on the subject of walkthroughs, I'll place the actual beginning of my tale right here. As I said, this happened on a quiet Monday, which was one of the slowest nights for customers. During the tourist season, we did pretty brisk business all through the week and weekends, but it was the middle of the winter and the hotel had never been smack dab in the middle of the tourist roads. You had to see one of our billboard ads or know where we were at already. So, if I was lucky enough to check anyone in, it was usually one of our regulars. The night this happened, I had just finished one of my walkthroughs, checking that there was ice in the machines, things like that. I had just returned to the desk and sat down in the office located behind it. From what I remember, I was doing paperwork when I happened to look up at the bay of monitors for the security cameras and spotted a guy in black standing just out of view of the windows out front. Being naturally curious, I continued watching him while he stood there looking around for anyone in the area. I guess when he was satisfied that nobody was watching, he pulled a black ski mask from his pocket and put it over his head and face. I didn't see a weapon at the time, but I sure wasn't going to give him time to pull it out. Since I had a good idea what he had planned, I ran as fast as I could to lock the front door so he couldn't do it. I could see him through the windows as we both ran for the doors, but I got to them first and turned the deadbolt just before his hand touched the handle. The mask he was wearing had a hole for the mouth and a sneer of disgust slowly grew on it. Seeing how angry this made him, my stupid, smug self mocked him with the biggest grin I could manage. He slowly raised his hand, and that's when I finally saw the gun. The smug grin disappeared from my face and was replaced by a look of abject fear. I couldn't see my face, of course, but I could tell from the smile growing on his he knew he was in charge. When his hand reached my eye level, I could literally see down the barrel of the gun. As he pulled back the hammer, the cylinder turned and clicked. Everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. Then, like he was putting an exclamation at the end of a sentence, he put the barrel to the glass. When he put his finger on the trigger, I honestly saw my life flash before me. It hadn't been a long one, and it was about to end. That's about the time I peed myself. I'm not gonna lie, it happened. For a second, I considered trying to make a break for it, but when I attempted to move, I was frozen stiff. So, in an act of acceptance, I closed my eyes and waited for the shot, but it never came. I have no idea how long I stood there, but when I finally got the courage to open my eyes, he was gone. I could feel my knees about to buckle, and a queasiness filled my stomach. There was a row of chairs next to me, and I managed to sit down before I collapsed. As I sat there, crouched over with my head between my knees, fighting the urge to vomit, I tried to figure out why I wasn't dead. Did he take pity on me? Did he not have the guts? Really, I didn't care. I was just happy to be alive, and if I ever meet that guy again in different circumstances, I'll thank him for not pulling that trigger. The idea of calling the cops went through my head, but I decided against it. They would most likely be unable to catch the guy, and I couldn't identify him. What I was going to do was change my pants and quit this terrible job at this terrible hotel and go to college after all. I finished out the night and quit the next morning. I told my boss about the attempted holdup and the guy with the mask, just out of courtesy, in case he decided to come back, and that was it. I enrolled at a local community college that spring. After my 2 years there, I moved on to a large Californian university where I eventually earned my MBA and went on to work at various corporations around Southern California and Nevada. I'm finally working for myself as a consultant and employ several others. Despite the overwhelming fear I felt that night, the incident ultimately turned out to be the wake-up call I needed to get my life in the right direction. I had spent so long in school I was in no hurry to move on to another. Besides, I'd witnessed the success of some of my friends were having without going to college, and I'd convinced myself it had nothing to offer me. However, I learned that night a lesson I'd like to pass on to young people just out of school. If you truly believe college is not for you, don't go. But you owe it to yourself to be very sure. Because if your life turns out to be different than you had hoped, you could end up like either one of those men, staring at each other through those glass doors, all those years ago.
This all happened 15 years ago. I was about 19 years old when I was offered a job by my cousin to work for her uncle's glass business. They install giant glass windows into tall buildings and skyscrapers. Not that it's too relevant to the story, but I thought it was worth mentioning. The catch to the job was that I had to temporarily move to Destin, Florida from Tampa. My cousin lived in Russellville, Alabama, and I really wanted to go visit the family there and leave with them together to go back down to Destin. Now, this was my first long-distance road trip, and my very first trip away from my immediate family. Back then, I was driving a green Mercury Sable, a car barely capable of getting groceries back home, but in my invincible youth, I didn't really care about that. I was just so pumped to be spreading my wings and getting out into the real world that the risks didn't really concern me. My mom and dad had tried to get me to plan and pack better, knowing the trip could have its pitfalls. But I mean, it wasn't like the trip was going to last days, and also fast food exists, so I wasn't really stressing out about that. I mean, I'm not stupid. I packed for the trip, and I'm going to be staying there for a few months in Destin. But they were really adamant on me bringing food, water, emergency supplies, etc. I declined because it wasn't the 1930s, and of course there's gas stations at every exit, and I had a Razor flip phone. My way of thinking was, what could possibly happen on two busy interstates? It wasn't like I was going to some far-off country with no cell service. Anyways, fast forward to the trip. I'm a Florida boy, so I had no idea Alabama could get so cold, and I also had no idea that the heat was broken in my car. I had never really used it. At first I'm thankful because by the time I reach Alabama, I'm tired as hell, and I had made a lot more stops than I anticipated. I still had a few hours to go, and the cold air was keeping me wide awake. Finally, I pull off the interstate and I start heading through these smaller numbered roads. The roads didn't really have conventional names like in Florida. They were just numbered, which I kinda found odd. After driving on those a bit, I started being sent down gravel roads. This was the days of MapQuest, so I didn't have a GPS guiding me through the just paved roads or rerouting me around roadblocks. I was starting to get really hungry and I thought back to my parents telling me to pack food. I really should have listened. The sketchiest thing with MapQuest was that you just printed out the directions, so you didn't really have a map to fall back on. So going out of your way to find fast food at an exit came with the potential of legitimately getting lost. So I had basically passed a few times to turn off for food because I was tired and I just didn't want to chance it. Instead, however, I was looking for something off the side of the road that I could easily pull in and then back out with no fuss. But more importantly, no risk of getting lost. My prayers were answered a little down the road when I saw a beat-up old country grocery store on my right-hand side. It didn't even have a name. It just said grocery right across the front of the white building. I pulled in because the light shining across the grocery sign was on, but found it odd that most of the lights inside were off. I'm not gonna lie, this gave me the creeps a little, but it didn't stop me from going up to the door. I was really starving and maybe this was a 24-hour place, but I wasn't sure. I saw a shadow move across the back of the long aisles as I approached the glass door and surprisingly opened it with ease. At this point, I was honestly half expecting them to be closed due to the lack of lighting inside, and I was really hoping that the owner would take pity on a tired traveler and let me grab some snacks. I then called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No one answered. I then said something along the lines of, "I saw you when I pulled up, and I was hoping you're still open." Again, no answer. Now, this was really naive of me, but I assumed that maybe the owner was just older or something and maybe he couldn't hear me, or that maybe he was deaf, so I went further back into the store. It honestly didn't really smell that great inside there, and I had hoped that they at least had some chips or something. At least those are sealed. Suddenly a man emerged from the back. "Oh, I'm so sorry. We were just about to close. How can I help you?" he asked with a smile. He clearly made me jump out of my skin at first, but he seemed friendly enough. Not the old man I was picturing before, but actually a much younger guy, maybe in his 30s. "Yeah, I just came up from Florida. It's been a long drive. I was kinda hoping you guys had something to eat for the trip." "Oh, we have plenty. What are you looking for exactly?" he said without taking his eyes off me. The guy had a really weird unblinking stare that just really put me on edge, but what made me the most uncomfortable was his smile. He smiled big, but his eyes never moved, as in the only way you could tell he was conveying an emotion was by looking at his mouth. The rest of his face stayed the same. Most people, you could tell they're smiling even if their mouth was covered, because you smile with your whole face, but not this guy. "Yeah, I just wanted some chips, maybe a Coke. Do you have any Doritos?" "Of course," he said, walking past me. He locked the door behind me before turning and smiling. "I don't want anyone else walking in," he chuckled. Him locking the door was really creepy, but I just shrugged it off because the reasoning was pretty sound, even though it felt off. "Follow me," the guy said as he walked towards the back of the store. I was young, but I really should have been smart enough to know that the store owners generally don't give customers a tour of the store, but I had lived a pretty sheltered life. I could feel that something was off, but I didn't want to offend him by asking questions like, "What's that smell?" and other things. We get to the back of the store to where those plastic flaps hang that separate the customer side and the back end. When the man sticks his hand through, parting through the plastic, then saying, "Right this way." Now alarm bells are starting to go off in my head, especially as he starts looking around and past me like someone who's selling drugs and trying to watch out for the police. Back there?" I ask and start to back up a little. That's when I then notice chips right beside me on the aisle. The guy noticed me see the chips and then says, "Yeah, back here. We got all our good stuff in the back. You can come take your pick." By this time, I had found the source of the buzzing. Flies are flying over the meat section, and the dim light that's reflecting off the packaging lets me know that it's been sitting there a while. "I'll just take this if that's alright," I say nervously as I grab a bag off the shelf next to me and then start backing up towards the door. "Trust me, those are no good. I have way better stuff back here." He smiles again, gesturing for me to head back. I fake pat my pockets, then saying, "Oh man, I think I forgot my wallet in my car. I'll be right back." As soon as the words left my lips, I then spun around and did a light jog to the front, increasing with speed as I approached the door. I make it to the door and twist the lock a couple times until I hear the click. I push the door open and turn back to look at where the man is, but he's gone. I jumped into that car and sped the fuck out of that parking lot and didn't stop again until I reached my cousin's house. This was by far one of the eeriest and creepiest things that have ever happened to me. This happened when I was 7 years old with my twin sister and mother. We had just entered our local grocery store, Surefine, when a man no more than 10 feet in front of us glanced over and immediately whipped his head back towards us. Now, as a quick side note, my twin and I at that age were always dressed in matching dresses, and we had long blonde hair that had always got us looks of awe and affection. But this was different. He was a bulky middle-aged man of mid-eastern descent, and had stopped what he was doing to fully look at us up and down. A really husky smile crossed his scruffy face. My mother paid no mind to this, as she was no stranger to creepy men herself. I immediately grumbled to my twin Cass how creepy it was the way the man was looking at us. So as we turned left to start going through the aisles, Cass and I turned and we saw the man walking toward us with his shopping cart. When we first made eye contact, he immediately turned his attention to a table with baked goods on it, which kinda stood out to Cass and I more than if he had just kept walking normally. So my mother's obviously shopping, and Cass and I just keep glancing back, and we keep catching the man at the end of every aisle that we enter, just staring with no expression on his face, and even from a slight distance, he was seemingly breathing like really weirdly. I also noticed that his cart continues to remain empty, except for the baked goods that he grabbed when we had first looked back at him. We tell my mother, but she just rolls her eyes at us and tells us that he probably thinks we're following him because we keep looking at him. The man disappears as we hit the last of the aisles, and Cass and I are already on a completely different topic by now, when we're heading for the registers, having almost completely forgotten about him within minutes. We're about to make it to the register when my sister asks my mom for a candy bar, and I quickly join, to which she then angrily replies that we don't have the money for it. We're both pouting at this point, and she threatens to leave us as she begins putting things on the conveyor belt. But then Cass and I watch my mother turn to face us again, when her expression completely changes and her eyes shift behind us. It's the man. He's sweating profusely at this point, and he's literally less than like a foot behind us. Cass and I immediately take a step forward towards our mother. The man laughs awkwardly, then apologizes, saying,
"Sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to scare you girls. You're all just so beautiful. These girls, are they yours?"
My mother kind of scoffs to this and then goes, "Yeah, they're mine." And he does that same awkward laugh again, then saying,
"I couldn't help but notice that you don't have the money to get them what they want. How old are they, and you as well? I could help you. I have lots of money. Money's no problem for me."
My mother's face then furrows in confusion and annoyance, then snapping, excuse me?" Like clockwork, he laughs again like it's some big joke, then says,
"I'm serious, how much?"
My mother stares at him blankly for a moment, and he continues,
"How much for the girls? I'd like both of them, but if you can only part with one, I could still make that work. I'll give you the money. Just name your price, and I can give them anything they want. Any candy they want."
He grins yet again and wipes his brow, looking down at us. My mother doesn't respond to him, just looks at us and growls, "Here, now." So we do as we were told, which was fine by us because we didn't want to be anywhere near this creepy man. The cashier was a teenage girl no older than 17, and she was just completely wide-eyed watching this conversation occur as she silently continues to scan our groceries. Once we were next to my mother, she then growls at the man, "If you so much as lay one fucking finger on my kids, I'll break it off and shove it down your throat," which were some pretty big words coming from my 4'11" mother. But the man's face darkens, and without even purchasing anything, he walks around the cash register and exits, but he doesn't get far. The entire front of the store is glass, so moments later we watch as he presses his face against the glass trying to see in, leaving a sweaty face print behind. Now, at this point, the cashier's alerting her manager and asking him to call the police. My mother immediately assures them that that's not necessary, and just asks the manager to walk us out to her car. We see no sign of the man as we unload our groceries and hop into the car. My mother quickly drives us home once we sit in the car for a few minutes, scanning for any signs that he might be waiting in a car or something. We eventually made it home safely, and nothing ever came of it. I don't know what happened to the man, but I truly hope he never convinced anyone to give him their kid. That's absolutely horrific to think about.